The year was 1347. Europe, though unsettled in small ways, appeared prosperous and orderly. The streets bustled with merchants, the churches echoed with hymns, and the sun, it seemed, was always on the horizon. Cities like Venice and Paris flourished. The towering cathedrals, carved from stone, stood as symbols of power and divinity. Life, for many, appeared full of promise. But beneath the surface of this apparent tranquility, there were whispers of a world teetering on the edge. Life in these medieval cities was a curious blend of vibrancy and decay. While the streets were crowded with life, they were also filled with an undercurrent of disease. Overcrowding was a fact of life for many. The cities were often cramped, the buildings close together, their windows offering little ventilation, their alleys dark and damp. The sheer number of people living together in these confined spaces created a perfect storm for illness to spread. Hygiene was almost non-existent. Bathing, for most, was considered an occasional luxury rather than a regular practice. People believed the air itself could become stale and unhealthy, a concept known as bad air, and much of their daily life was framed by the simple and often mistaken understanding of health and cleanliness. Waste, both human and animal, was thrown into the streets, the stench mingling with the smells of freshly baked bread and fish. Rats, too, scurried between the cracks of the cobbled streets, unnoticed, feeding on scraps and, unbeknownst to anyone, breeding in the shadows. Society, despite its progress in art and architecture, was still shaped by old ideas of power. Kings ruled, bishops preached, and serfs toiled beneath them. The vast majority of people had little access to education and lived with the weight of superstition and religious fervor. The church wielded significant power, guiding both the moral compass and the social order of the people. It was an era where fate seemed preordained and often harsh. But this society, so sure of its place in the world, was fragile. The very systems that held it together were built on shaky foundations. It didn't take much for this delicate balance to be upended. Little did anyone know that within months, everything would change. What was about to unfold was nothing short of catastrophic. An invisible storm gathering strength in the east, a storm that would leave nothing standing in its wake. It was a quiet morning when the first rumors of a deadly illness began to spread from the east, creeping across the lands of the Mongols. Some said it was a punishment from God, a warning to repent. Others whispered that it was a curse, a malevolent force moving through the earth. The few who had the knowledge to understand the scale of what was coming were too few to matter. Most were more concerned with the next harvest or the latest news from the king's court. But beneath the surface, something ancient and terrible was stirring, something the world was unprepared to face. The seemingly peaceful world of 1347 would soon be shattered forever. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. But by the time it reached Italy, it was too late to stop. The Black Death, an unseen force, began its swift and merciless journey across the continent. The first signs were innocuous enough, almost unremarkable. Unusual deaths in small villages, strange swelling on the necks of the few unlucky victims, and whispers in the dark of a new sickness, spreading faster than the news of its existence. People tried to carry on with their lives, dismissing it as just another strange illness. But this was no ordinary disease. As the plague arrived in Genoa, and soon after in Venice, it quickly became clear that this was unlike anything they had ever seen. At first, the symptoms were easily confused with other illnesses of the time, fevers, chills, aches. But within days, something darker emerged. People began to feel the gnawing ache in their limbs, followed by an excruciating pain that sent them to their knees. But the true terror lay in what followed. Dark, purplish blotches appearing on the skin, growing larger by the hour. In many cases, victims died within just a few days, sometimes hours, after the first signs of infection. The city streets, once filled with the busy sounds of life, fell eerily silent. The once prosperous trade routes, the lifeblood of European commerce, suddenly became conduits of death. It was as if the very air had turned toxic, and no one was safe. Merchants, priests, nobles, and beggars all were struck down with terrifying speed. In the space of just a few weeks, the once thriving city of Genoa was brought to its knees, its people overwhelmed by an invisible force. Panic spread faster than the disease. The church, which had always offered answers, found itself scrambling for an explanation. Priests, who once stood at the pulpit delivering sermons with unwavering conviction, were now gripped with fear. Some claimed it was the wrath of God, an opportunity for sinners to repent. Others, more cynical, saw the plague as a form of divine retribution, a punishment for the sins of mankind. But no explanation seemed to make sense. People began to question their beliefs, unsure of where to turn for comfort in a world suddenly turned upside down. Governments, too, were helpless. King and emperor alike, accustomed to wielding their power with absolute certainty, found their authority crumbling in the face of a force they could not fight. The plague did not discriminate. There were no fortified castles or royal titles that could offer protection. Nobles, just as vulnerable as their subjects, began to flee, abandoning their cities in search of safety that didn't exist. As the plague continued to ravage Italy, the news of its spread across Europe created a wave of terror, pushing even the most rational minds to the brink. The first deaths were horrific, but what came after was worse. No one could stop the disease, no one could explain why it was happening, and no one had the faintest idea how to prevent it. The world was left helpless in the face of something so incomprehensible, so far beyond human understanding, that it began to feel like the end of the world itself. In the midst of this chaos, some fled to the mountains, some shut themselves in their homes, hoping isolation would keep them safe. But many others turned to darker answers, to superstition, and even to witch hunts, hoping that by expelling evil from their midst, they could escape the plague. Yet, no matter the method, one truth became undeniable: death was coming for everyone. As the disease spread, what started as a whisper of fear became a full-blown panic. Entire villages were wiped out, entire families gone in the blink of an eye. The world was forever changed, and it hadn't even begun to see the worst of it yet. The plague was not just a disease, it was a revolution of death, shaking the very foundations of society. And then, as quickly as it began, the plague began its inexorable march north, across the rest of Europe. The survivors, if they could be called that, would live in a world that was unrecognizable, a world reshaped forever by the terror they had just endured. But one thing was certain: there was no going back. Europe had been altered forever. The plague was gone, its shadow now cast over a land it had stripped of life. The streets were empty. The once lively towns and villages stood silent, their windows darkened by the absence of laughter, their marketplaces devoid of the clamour of daily trade. What had once been vibrant hubs of human interaction now felt like tombs, where only the wind dared to whisper between decaying walls. The very air was heavy with grief, as though the earth itself had been scarred by the loss. For those who remained, the silence was deafening. The survivors moved through this hushed world with a strange detachment, caught between the weight of their loss and the incomprehensible reality that they had somehow lived through it all. How does one even begin to process such devastation? How do you mourn what you've lost when you don't know if tomorrow will bring your own end? The grief was not only personal, but collective. Families, communities, and entire towns had been erased. The survivors were left to navigate the shattered remnants of a world they no longer recognized. It wasn't just the physical absence of the dead that left a mark, but the deeper, more profound silence of a world that had lost its sense of purpose. What drove these people to move forward, to try to rebuild what had been broken beyond recognition? What had been a bustling city with thousands of voices was now a ghost town, and the world that had existed just a few short months ago was no more. As much as survivors wanted to rebuild their lives, there was no map to guide them. Even the simple act of grieving felt foreign. How do you grieve for the whole world? How do you mourn the loss of a time when you believed things would always be the same? The social fabric, once carefully woven over generations, had unraveled. The rich had fled, the powerful had abandoned their cities, and the poor had perished, leaving behind a hollowed-out world. Communities that had relied on one another for support were now scattered and disconnected. The survivors found themselves living among ruins, forced to create new ways to live together, ways that were still unformed, uncertain, and fragile. And yet, among this vast wreckage, some remained. Some still wandered through the streets, unsure of what they were supposed to do next, but driven by the primal force of survival. They were living, and that alone felt like a victory, though it came with a cost. The world had changed, and so had they. The survivors were not the same people they had been before the plague. Grief and fear had etched their faces, left their hands shaking. Even their laughter, when it came, felt hollow, as if the joy they once knew had been drowned by the enormity of what had happened. In the end, the survivors were faced with a new question. What comes after the end of everything? And the answer was painfully simple. They moved forward, not because they had a clear path, but because they had no choice. Life was all they had left, even if it no longer resembled what they once knew. As the survivors wandered through this empty world, they faced the task of finding meaning in their continued existence. Every day was a struggle, not just for food or shelter, but for the very will to keep going. And yet, some did. But in their eyes, a question lingered, a question that had no answer. How does one begin again after witnessing the end of all things? The instinct to survive is as old as humanity itself, woven into the very fabric of our being. When death comes knocking, it stirs something deep within, a primal urge to fight, to flee, to hold on to life with everything you've got. In the wake of the plague, that instinct was tested in ways no one had ever imagined. For some, survival was a matter of pure luck. Entire families had been wiped out, yet the lone survivor found themselves standing alone, unsure of how they had made it through. Was it chance that had spared them, or was there something more to it? Could fate, or divine intervention, have had a hand in deciding who would live and who would die? These were the questions that lingered in the minds of the survivors. But luck alone couldn't explain it all. Many survivors, after witnessing the suffering of those around them, began to wonder if there was something deeper at play. Was it the human will to survive, or something more mystical, something beyond human comprehension, that determined the fate of the living? The reality was, the survivors had no answers, only fragments of their own experience, each one trying to make sense of the chaos that had torn their world apart. Medicine, at the time, was of little help. There were no cures, no vaccines, no understanding of how the disease spread or what caused it. The most that could be done was to pray, to offer sacrifices, and to hope for the best. And yet, some survived. The lucky ones, it seemed, had some combination of strong health, good fortune, and perhaps the will to endure. These survivors lived with the weight of their survival, knowing full well that the very same plague that had ravaged their communities had left them scarred in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Faith, too, played a complicated role. For many, the plague was seen as divine retribution. It was a punishment from God, a warning to repent before it was too late. But for others, faith was not about punishment, it was about hope. It was about believing that something beyond the physical world could protect them from the terror that gripped the land. Perhaps it was the strength of their belief that allowed them to survive, a power they could not see but felt within. Yet, even faith could not shield them from the trauma. The survivors had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The bodies of their loved ones, piled high in mass graves. The faces of neighbors who had once greeted them with a smile, now frozen in death. What did it mean to survive in a world where death was omnipresent, a world where nothing seemed to make sense anymore? What made the difference between life and death for so many? Was it luck, faith, or something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface? As the survivors grappled with these questions, they also had to face the truth of their own humanity. They were no longer the same people who had lived in the world before the plague. They were survivors forever changed, forever marked by the experience. And as they emerged from the shadows of death, the survivors found themselves asking a new question. How could they rebuild? How could they live again in a world so profoundly altered? The answers, though unclear, would begin to take shape in the coming years, as survivors turned their grief into resilience, their trauma into strength. But for now, they could only move forward, unsure of what the future held, but certain that they had emerged from the darkness, for better or for worse. The plague had left its mark, but so too had the human spirit. The survivors, in their quiet strength, would find a way to live again. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 3. The Rebuilding Process. 2,000 words. Asterisk, asterisk. A world once teeming with life now lay in ruins. The air, heavy with the stench of decay, seemed to carry the weight of millions of lost souls. In the aftermath of the Black Death, the very foundations of society had crumbled. Entire villages were wiped off the map, their houses abandoned, their fields left to overgrow. The sound of laughter, the chatter of merchants, the cries of children, all of it was gone. The bustling energy that had once defined the rhythm of daily life now lay buried under the silence of death. For the survivors, the questions began to swirl. How do you begin again after everything has been erased? The economic structures that had once supported the land were shattered. Trade routes, the lifeblood of Europe's economy, had been severed. Markets, where goods had once been exchanged with vigor, now sat empty, their merchants nowhere to be found. The skilled labor force, essential to any prosperous society, had been decimated. Craftsmen, builders, and farmers, once the backbone of Europe, were now little more than memories. The collapse wasn't just economic, it was also social. The intricate web of relationships that had held society together unraveled with frightening speed. Nobles fled, abandoning their estates, their castles left to rot in a world that no longer seemed to need them. The once mighty church, which had been the center of spiritual and moral guidance, was weakened. Many lost their faith entirely, while others clung to it, seeking solace in a time of despair. But for the most part, there was no authority left to guide the survivors. Governments faltered, laws were ignored, and order disintegrated. What remained was a fractured world where chaos was the only constant. As the survivors picked their way through the ruins, the question of what came next lingered in the air. What would they rebuild? Could they even rebuild? The survivors weren't just mourning the loss of loved ones and livelihoods. They were grappling with the loss of a world they had known, a world that no longer existed. The familiar rhythms of life had disappeared, and what remained was a shattered version of reality, one where survival alone became the focus. Yet, amid this chaos, something began to stir. The human spirit is resilient, and despite the overwhelming weight of grief and destruction, the survivors sought to piece together what was left. It wasn't easy. There was no clear roadmap for how to rebuild a society that had been undone in such a brutal, all-encompassing way. And yet, the need for something to cling to anything was too strong to ignore. Small communities began to form again. Neighbors who had once been strangers banded together, united by the shared experience of loss. Farmers began to till the land again, though the fields were sparse and uncertain. People sought out old skills, knowledge that had been passed down through generations, trying to revive what had once been second nature. But for every small victory, there was a greater challenge. It wasn't just the physical labor of rebuilding, it was the emotional toll of having to reinvent an entire world from the ashes of a collapsed society. The survivors worked as best they could, often in silence, the weight of grief still too fresh to allow for much conversation. And yet, slowly, as the months passed, things began to change. The old social order had been irrevocably altered, and no one knew what the future held. But the survivors had no choice but to move forward, as uncertain as that path seemed. As they rebuilt their homes, their livelihoods, and their communities, one thing became increasingly clear. What had been lost could not simply be returned. What lay ahead was a world entirely different from the one that had existed before. The devastation of the plague had taken something far more valuable than life it had taken, the very framework of society itself. But out of this destruction, there arose something unexpected. A new world began to take shape, one born from the ruins of the old. Innovation, once stifled by tradition and the weight of established systems, now flourished. The survivors, left with no other choice, began to question everything. What had worked before the systems, the practices, the ways of thinking, had led them to this moment of catastrophe. And so, they began to look for new answers, new ways of doing things, new methods of surviving, in a world forever changed. The old agricultural practices, which had once relied heavily on feudal systems and manual labor, began to be rethought. With so many workers gone, those who remained needed to find more efficient ways to cultivate the land. New farming techniques, such as crop rotation, which helped conserve the soil, began to take root. The survivors found that they needed to rethink how they farmed, how they lived off the land. They needed to be smarter, more resourceful. But it wasn't just farming that saw change. The very nature of industry began to shift. In towns that had once been home to skilled artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, the labor force had shrunk dramatically. Yet, necessity is the mother of invention, and the survivors found new ways to adapt. In some places, entire industries were transformed, with new tools and methods emerging to replace the outdated ways of the past. For example, The limited workforce forced some towns to introduce early forms of division of labor, allowing individuals to specialize in certain tasks, thus increasing productivity. These changes didn't just occur in the fields or factories, they were mirrored in the realm of governance, religion, and culture. As old social structures crumbled, new forms of leadership began to take shape. Some communities, realizing the weaknesses of hierarchical rule, began to experiment with more collective forms of decision-making. There was a growing desire for a different kind of order, one that was more flexible, more responsive to the needs of the people. The idea of democracy, though still far from reality, began to make small but significant strides in the minds of those who had survived the horrors of the plague. In religion, too, the plague sparked a period of reflection and transformation. The Church, which had long held sway over the hearts and minds of the people, found its power diminished. Some survivors turned away from religion altogether, disillusioned by the inability of their faith to save them from the plague. Others sought new forms of spirituality, turning to mysticism or local beliefs to fill the void left by the old ways. This wasn't the end of religion, but rather the beginning of a shift that would slowly but surely transform the way people approached faith. Perhaps most notably, the Black Death catalyzed a renaissance of sorts, though no one could have predicted it at the time. Artists and thinkers, in the wake of the devastation, began to push the boundaries of what was known and accepted. They explored new ideas, sought new ways to express themselves, and began to create works that reflected the disquiet of their times. These shifts in art and culture would set the stage for the great intellectual and artistic rebirth of the Renaissance in the centuries to come. As the survivors tried to rebuild what had been lost, they were forced to grapple with the question of what kind of world they wanted to create. And in the process, they began to transform that world in ways they could not have foreseen. In the rubble of the old, new ideas began to take root, ideas that would change the course of history. Could this devastation lead to something greater? The survivors didn't know it yet, but they were laying the groundwork for a new age, one built not just on survival, but on a renewed vision for what humanity could achieve. The rebuilding process, though slow and painful, marked the beginning of something powerful. The survivors had not only endured the worst of times, they had found a way to reinvent the world brick by brick, idea by idea. What had been lost could never be replaced, but something new was beginning to emerge, something that would shape the future for generations to come. Chapter 4. The Plague and Religion, 2,000 words. The aftermath of the Black Death created fertile ground for new ideas to take root. As traditional religious structures faltered and the spiritual crisis deepened, many survivors began to seek alternative explanations for the tragedy that had torn their world apart. The death toll had shattered not only the physical world, but also the belief systems that had once defined it. The survivors, disillusioned and lost, began to turn to new sources of meaning. Out of this despair, a new spiritual landscape emerged. Mysticism flourished, its emphasis on direct personal experience of the divine, offering a potent alternative to the institutionalized religion of the Church. People sought meaning not in the dogma of the clergy, but in the exploration of their own spiritual journeys. Mystics, individuals who claimed to have direct encounters with the divine, began to be seen as authorities on matters of faith. Their teachings, often vague and open to interpretation, resonated with people who had been left questioning the traditional explanations of life and death. But mysticism wasn't the only new belief system to emerge. The horrors of the plague also gave rise to new sects religious movements that promised a different path to salvation, one not bound by the rules of the established church. Some of these movements sought to return to what they saw as a purer, more primitive form of Christianity, one that placed a greater emphasis on personal piety and asceticism. Others rejected the church altogether, advocating for a more individualistic approach to faith. These movements were often radical and, in some cases, dangerous. In times of crisis, people were more likely to be drawn to ideas that seemed to offer immediate relief or answers, no matter how unconventional. Some of the most extreme sects advocated for the abandonment of all earthly goods, believing that the world was coming to an end and that only those who lived a life of strict purity would be saved. Their beliefs spread quickly in the aftermath of the plague, as people sought to escape the horrors of their present reality by immersing themselves in an idealized, otherworldly existence. The rise of these new religious ideas also sparked a growing sense of disillusionment with the traditional power structures that had once governed Europe. The Church, in particular, was increasingly seen as ineffectual and disconnected from the realities of the people. As a result, secular ideas began to gain a stronger foothold. The search for answers, which had once been the province of the clergy, now expanded into the realms of philosophy and reason. Some survivors, particularly among the educated classes, began to question not just the role of religion in their lives, but also the very idea of divine intervention. For them, the plague was not a punishment but a random, senseless event, one that could only be understood through the lens of science and rational thought. This shift in thinking marked the beginning of a slow but profound transformation in European society. The relationship between religion and science, once seen as mutually exclusive, began to evolve. Scholars began to turn their attention to the natural world, seeking to understand the causes of disease and death, not in terms of divine will, but in terms of biology and medicine. The emergence of secular ideas, combined with the decline of the Church's authority, laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would come in the centuries to follow. As the survivors grappled with the spiritual and intellectual upheaval brought on by the plague, they found themselves standing at a crossroads. The world they had known was gone, and with it, the beliefs that had sustained them. In its place, new systems of thought and belief were taking root, systems that would define the future of Europe. What had begun as a desperate search for answers in the wake of catastrophe would eventually give birth to a new era of intellectual and spiritual exploration, one in which reason and faith would no longer be so easily separated. The rise of these new beliefs was not just a response to the plague, it was a reflection of the deep, enduring need of humanity to find meaning in the face of suffering. And in the years to come, these ideas would help shape the course of European history, setting the stage for an era of unprecedented change. As Europe began to rebuild, it did not just rebuild its physical structures, it began to rebuild its very understanding of the world. The legacy of the Black Death would live on, not only in the lives of the survivors, but in the spiritual and intellectual revolutions that would reshape the future. The plague, in its devastation, had given rise to new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing, and ultimately, a new way of living. The aftermath of the Black Death created fertile ground for new ideas to take root. As traditional religious structures faltered and the spiritual crisis deepened, many survivors began to seek alternative explanations for the tragedy that had torn their world apart. The death toll had shattered not only the physical world, but also the belief systems that had once defined it. The survivors, disillusioned and lost, began to turn to new sources of meaning. Out of this despair, a new spiritual landscape emerged. Mysticism flourished, its emphasis on direct personal experience of the divine, offering a potent alternative to the institutionalized religion of the Church. People sought meaning not in the dogma of the clergy, but in the exploration of their own spiritual journeys. Mystics, individuals who claimed to have direct encounters with the divine, began to be seen as authorities on matters of faith. Their teachings, often vague and open to interpretation, resonated with people who had been left questioning the traditional explanations of life and death. But mysticism wasn't the only new belief system to emerge. The horrors of the plague also gave rise to new sects, religious movements that promised a different path to salvation, one not bound by the rules of the established church. Some of these movements sought to return to what they saw as a purer, more primitive form of Christianity, one that placed a greater emphasis on personal piety and asceticism. Others rejected the church altogether, advocating for a more individualistic approach to faith. These movements were often radical and, in some cases, dangerous. In times of crisis, people were more likely to be drawn to ideas that seemed to offer immediate relief or answers, no matter how unconventional. Some of the most extreme sects advocated for the abandonment of all earthly goods, believing that the world was coming to an end and that only those who lived a life of strict purity would be saved. Their beliefs spread quickly in the aftermath of the plague, as people sought to escape the horrors of their present reality by immersing themselves in an idealized, otherworldly existence. The rise of these new religious ideas also sparked a growing sense of disillusionment with the traditional power structures that had once governed Europe. The Church, in particular, was increasingly seen as ineffectual and disconnected from the realities of the people. As a result, secular ideas began to gain a stronger foothold. The search for answers, which had once been the province of the clergy, now expanded into the realms of philosophy and reason. Some survivors, particularly among the educated classes, began to question not just the role of religion in their lives, but also the very idea of divine intervention. For them, the plague was not a punishment but a random, senseless event, one that could only be understood through the lens of science and rational thought. This shift in thinking marked the beginning of a slow but profound transformation in European society. The relationship between religion and science, once seen as mutually exclusive, began to evolve. Scholars began to turn their attention to the natural world, seeking to understand the causes of disease and death, not in terms of divine will, but in terms of biology and medicine. The emergence of secular ideas, combined with the decline of the Church's authority, laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would come in the centuries to follow. As the survivors grappled with the spiritual and intellectual upheaval brought on by the plague, they found themselves standing at a crossroads. The world they had known was gone, and with it, the beliefs that had sustained them. In its place, new systems of thought and belief were taking root, systems that would define the future of Europe. What had begun as a desperate search for answers in the wake of catastrophe would eventually give birth to a new era of intellectual and spiritual exploration, one in which reason and faith would no longer be so easily separated. The rise of these new beliefs was not just a response to the plague, it was a reflection of the deep, enduring need of humanity to find meaning in the face of suffering. And in the years to come, these ideas would help shape the course of European history, setting the stage for an era of unprecedented change. As Europe began to rebuild, it did not just rebuild its physical structures, it began to rebuild its very understanding of the world. The legacy of the Black Death would live on, not only in the lives of the survivors, but in the spiritual and intellectual revolutions that would reshape the future. The plague, in its devastation, had given rise to new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing, and ultimately, a new way of living. In the year 1347, as the Black Death began to sweep across Europe, the medical world was ill-prepared to face the devastation it would bring. The tools and knowledge available to medieval doctors were rudimentary at best, and their understanding of disease was largely rooted in outdated theories and ancient practices. Medicine, in its most primitive form, was still deeply entangled with superstition and religious beliefs, far from the science-driven field we know today. Medical treatments in the medieval period were guided more by tradition than by empirical evidence. Bloodletting, one of the most commonly prescribed remedies, was believed to restore balance to the body's humours, an ancient concept that held that health was determined by the equilibrium of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If a person was sick, the prevailing theory was that one or more of these humours was out of balance. To remedy this, doctors would often drain blood from the patient, either through leeches or by making incisions in the skin. It was believed that removing blood could expel harmful humours and restore health, but in reality, it often weakened the patient further, sometimes even hastening their death. Alongside bloodletting, herbal remedies were commonly used. Physicians would rely on concoctions made from plants, many of which were based on centuries-old texts and folk knowledge. While some herbs may have had mild medicinal effects, most of these remedies were ineffective against the deadly diseases that ravaged the population. The most well-known medieval cure for the plague was the use of theriac, a complex mixture of various herbs, animal parts, and sometimes even poison. It was marketed as a universal antidote, but in the case of the Black Death, it was useless. Even the physicians themselves were largely powerless. Many were educated men who had spent years in universities studying the ancient medical texts of Hippocrates and Galen, but their knowledge was confined to the theories and practices that had been passed down for centuries, knowledge that was ill-suited to dealing with the rapid, unexplained spread of a deadly new disease. Doctors were often just as perplexed as the common people, unsure of how to treat the plague, let alone how to stop it from spreading. Their failure to understand the nature of the disease, or its origins, led many to turn to explanations that had nothing to do with science at all. As death spread through Europe like wildfire, people sought answers in religious explanations, hoping that divine intervention could offer relief. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for mankind's sins. Towns and villages organized mass processions, praying for deliverance, while others sought penance through acts of self-flagellation, believing that suffering on earth could atone for their sins and avert God's wrath. The Church, too, struggled with the crisis, unable to offer any definitive answers or solutions. Instead of calming the masses, the Church's inability to explain the plague or offer an effective remedy only deepened the sense of fear and confusion. At the same time, superstitions took root. Some people believed that the plague was carried by bad air, or time's miasma asterisk, a theory that held sway for centuries before the advent of germ theory. To protect themselves, people would carry flowers or herbs to ward off the evil air, while others used perfumes, incense, and even burned fires to purify the air around them. Charms, amulets, and spells were also in high demand, as desperate individuals sought to protect themselves from the invisible death that lurked around every corner. In this environment of confusion, fear, and powerlessness, doctors stood helpless. They were trained to treat diseases they understood, diseases that followed known patterns, but nothing in their education had prepared them for the speed, unpredictability, and lethality of the Black Death. The plague didn't behave like any disease they had ever encountered. There was no treatment that seemed to work, no cure that could stem the tide of death. As the disease spread relentlessly across Europe, doctors and patients alike were left in the dark. It was in this void of understanding that the medieval medical world found itself confronted by a catastrophe beyond its capacity to control. For all the efforts of physicians, priests, and common folk, the Black Death proved unstoppable. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming tragedy, something profound was about to shift. The medical world, which had been rooted in ancient texts and traditional remedies, was about to be shaken to its core. What followed would change the course of medicine forever, as the aftermath of the plague paved the way for a new understanding of disease, health, and the human body. From the ashes of medieval ignorance, a new age of medicine began to take shape. The Black Death, though a catastrophe that claimed millions of lives, pushed humanity to confront its lack of understanding about disease and the human body. While medieval doctors had been powerless to stop the plague, the devastation it caused prompted a wave of change in medical thought, setting the stage for the eventual rise of modern medicine. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, it became painfully clear that the existing medical practices, rooted in ancient theories of humours and superstition, were inadequate. The sheer scale of death forced people to re-evaluate their understanding of disease. The question that loomed large was not just how to treat illness, but how to prevent it. This marked the beginning of the shift from a world where disease was seen as a punishment or random act of fate, to a world where disease would eventually be understood through science, observation, and reason. One of the first steps toward this new understanding was the rise of quarantine. Cities, once ravaged by the plague, began to implement strict quarantine measures. Ships arriving from plague-stricken areas were forced to anchor off the coast for weeks, sometimes months, before they could dock. This practice, though rudimentary, marked an early attempt to contain the spread of disease by isolating those who might be infected. Over time, quarantine became an essential public health strategy that would save countless lives in the centuries to come. In addition to quarantine, the medical community began to take its first steps toward understanding the nature of disease transmission. While they were still unaware of the existence of germs, the plague made it clear that contagion was real. The idea of isolation, of separating the sick from the healthy, was a foundational concept in the development of epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread. Although the medical community had no scientific framework to understand how diseases spread, the plague provided the practical experience that would eventually lead to a better understanding of disease transmission. This period also saw the earliest attempts at organizing public health systems. As governments struggled to deal with the plague, they began to take a more active role in public health. Cities established pest houses to isolate the sick, and some even created municipal hospitals to care for those who could not afford private care. The idea that health could be managed and regulated by the state, a radical notion at the time, began to take hold. Perhaps most notably, the Black Death pushed the boundaries of medical inquiry. Physicians, confronted with the plague's inexplicable nature, were driven to question the assumptions of ancient medical texts. The centuries-old teachings of Hippocrates and Galen were no longer enough to explain what was happening. Doctors began to push the limits of their knowledge, seeking new answers, even if they were still trapped in the dark about the actual causes of the disease. This search for new knowledge, spurred by the catastrophe of the plague, laid the foundation for the scientific revolution in medicine. While the medieval world was not yet ready to understand the plague in scientific terms, the catastrophe set in motion the development of ideas that would eventually lead to groundbreaking discoveries in medicine. The legacy of the Black Death, tragic as it was, can be seen in the very advancements in medicine that would come centuries later. The shift from medieval ignorance to modern science did not happen overnight, but the Black Death, with all its horror and devastation, marked the turning point. As the world began to recover from the plague, medical practices slowly but surely began to evolve. The medieval ideas of disease, grounded in superstition and ancient texts, were replaced by an emerging understanding based on observation and reason. What had begun as a time of fear and hopelessness became the catalyst for the birth of modern medicine, an era that would eventually bring with it the cures and knowledge that would shape the future of humanity. And in the years to come, the lessons learned from the devastation of the Black Death would guide doctors and scientists toward a deeper understanding of health, disease, and the human body. The plague had not just altered the course of history, it had changed the very way we understand life and death. And from that shift, a new world of medicine began to emerge, one built on the principles of discovery, reason, and an ever-deepening search for truth. The Black Death was more than just a pandemic. It was a force that tore through the very fabric of medieval society. It was a world where power flowed steadily from the top down the monarchs. The church and the aristocracy were the central figures who maintained order and control. But when millions of people, from peasant to king, were claimed by the plague, everything began to unravel. Communities that had once thrived in a delicate balance were now scattered, disoriented, and broken. At its core, medieval society had been rigid, built upon a feudal system that left the majority of the population with little power or voice. Peasants toiled the land under the command of feudal lords, bound by birth to a life of service, while the church offered both spiritual and political direction. The monarchy, too, was a symbol of divine authority, maintaining the power of kings and queens through bloodlines, laws, and military might. All of these pillars were severely weakened by the plague's indiscriminate reach. The very structure of society was brought into question, and the survivors, shaken by loss, began to reconsider the roles they had played in the system. For the peasants, whose lives had been governed by the whims of the lords, the plague's arrival brought both fear and an unexpected opportunity. With so many of the labor force wiped out, the survivors found themselves in the rare position of power. The labor shortage created an environment in which workers could demand higher wages, better living conditions, and more freedom from the rigid demands of their feudal lords. This shift would lead to widespread unrest, as peasants began to recognize the possibility of a new kind of freedom. But it wasn't just the peasants who felt the impact. The monarchy and the church also suffered from the loss of so many members of their ranks. Church officials, once seen as the unquestioned moral authority, found themselves helpless in the face of a catastrophe that defied their explanations. The clergy, no longer able to provide the answers that had once given people comfort, saw their influence wane. As the faithful turned away from the church, some began to look elsewhere for guidance, and others abandoned their faith altogether. The nobility too was shaken. Many of the wealthy fled their estates to escape the plague, leaving their land vulnerable and their communities leaderless. As the economy faltered and the social hierarchy collapsed, people began to question the very system that had governed their lives. No longer could the lords assert their power so easily. No longer could the monarchy rely on divine right to justify their rule. In many ways, the Black Death had given the people the one thing they had never had before: power over their own lives. As the survivors began to navigate the aftermath of the plague, they found themselves living in a world of uncertainty, where the old structures no longer held sway. Traditional systems of governance began to break down, and for the first time in centuries, there was a glimmer of possibility that a new order might arise. The world had been torn apart, but from the chaos, something new might emerge. The question now was, who would rise to power in this new, fractured world? But the answer was not clear. With the social order in disarray, no one could be certain who would step in to fill the void left by the plague. Would it be the survivors, those who had once been at the bottom of the social ladder, now with the power to demand a better life? Or would the old systems reassert themselves once the immediate shock had passed? The future was uncertain, and for many, it seemed like the foundations of the world itself had been shaken beyond recognition. In the wake of the Black Death, survivors found themselves not just grappling with loss, but with a newfound power. The labor shortage, which had crippled the old social order, also created a rare opportunity for change. For the first time in centuries, the common people, peasants, laborers, and workers had the upper hand. They could demand better wages, better working conditions, and, perhaps most importantly, they could demand more respect. What had once been a rigid, immovable hierarchy now seemed fluid and malleable. The sudden scarcity of labour drove up wages, as landowners were desperate for workers to tend to their fields and maintain their estates. For peasants, this meant a rare chance to negotiate their position. With fewer workers available, the power shifted to those who remained. The once feared feudal lords were now dependent on their serfs and labourers, unable to impose the same level of control. This new leverage allowed peasants to demand better conditions, more rights, and even some degree of autonomy from their masters. This shift was not immediate or uniform, but it laid the groundwork for the gradual erosion of feudalism that would come in the centuries ahead. This period also saw the rise of a more visible and influential middle class. As the economic structure shifted, wealth began to be distributed more evenly among the survivors. Merchants, artisans, and tradespeople, those who had once been at the mercy of aristocratic whims, now found themselves in a more powerful position. With the collapse of traditional hierarchies, this new middle class began to rise in prominence. They controlled the production and distribution of goods, and they increasingly gained influence in local and even national politics. Their fortunes allowed them to challenge the authority of the old aristocracy, and over time, they began to shape a new economic order. As a result, the old idea of the rigid, unchangeable social ladder, one where birth dictated one's place, began to lose its grip on society. The once unquestioned position of the nobility was no longer secure. For the first time in history, upward mobility became possible for those who were not born into wealth or power. The social structure was still hierarchical, but it was no longer as inflexible as it had once been. People could rise based on skill, trade, or new wealth, things that were no longer dictated solely by their birthright. This transformation was especially evident in the cities. Urbanization, already beginning before the plague, surged as survivors flocked to cities in search of work and opportunities. Cities became hubs of trade, commerce, and new ideas. The feudal system, with its reliance on rural land ownership, had little place in these urban centers, where new forms of economic and social organization were taking root. What emerged was a more fluid, more dynamic social landscape, one that valued individual effort, skill, and economic contribution over lineage or inheritance. The Black Death had not just decimated populations, it had also shattered the old ways of doing things. In its wake, a new social order began to emerge, one where power was more evenly distributed, where the common people had a voice, and where old systems of governance and hierarchy were slowly but surely being replaced by more flexible, more modern structures. The survivors of the plague found themselves in a position of power, but it was not the power to return to the old ways. It was the power to build something new, to reshape society in a way that reflected the experiences and struggles they had endured. It was a world where, for the first time, the ordinary person could assert their value and their rights in a way that had once been unimaginable. But this new order did not come easily. The old aristocracy, the church, and the monarchy were slow to relinquish their control, and the transition to a new social order was not smooth. There were struggles, rebellions, and conflicts, many of them fueled by the rising tensions between the old and new ways. But as the years passed, the impact of the plague became clearer. It had irrevocably altered the social landscape of Europe, breaking down old barriers and giving rise to new opportunities for those who had once been voiceless. In the years that followed, the survivors of the Black Death did not just rebuild, they reinvented the world. The old systems of feudalism and class hierarchy began to give way to a more fluid and dynamic society, one where social mobility, at least in some places, became a reality. The power structures that had once defined medieval Europe were forever changed, and from the ashes of the old world, a new order began to take shape. This social upheaval did not stop with the labourers and peasants, it rippled through every level of society, setting the stage for the profound economic changes that would unfold in the coming centuries. The rise of the middle class and the slow decline of feudalism paved the way for the dawn of a new economic era, one that would give birth to capitalism and change the course of European history. And it all began in the wake of a disease that had once seemed like the end of the world. The Black Death, while a catastrophic event in its own right, marked the beginning of one of the most significant shifts in human history. What followed was not just the rebuilding of shattered cities, but the transformation of an entire economic system. The plague, with its indiscriminate destruction, accelerated the decline of feudalism, setting the stage for the rise of capitalism, a new economic order that would forever change Europe and the world. Feudalism had been the backbone of medieval society, a system where the land was owned by nobles and worked by peasants. In exchange for protection, peasants were bound to the land they worked, paying rent or offering labour in exchange for their livelihood. It was a static, rigid system that depended on a large labour force to sustain it. But when the Black Death swept through Europe, it decimated the population, leaving a vast labour shortage in its wake. The old system, based on a surplus of cheap labour, began to falter. With so many workers dead, surviving peasants suddenly found themselves in a position of power. The feudal lords, who had once held the upper hand, were now desperate for workers to cultivate their fields and maintain their estates. The scarcity of labour meant that peasants could demand better wages and more favourable working conditions. In some places, entire villages were abandoned, as workers fled for better opportunities in towns and cities. The old system of serfdom, which had kept people tied to the land for centuries, was suddenly being undermined by the very thing that had brought so much death, the plague. The labour shortage was not just a temporary disruption, it was the catalyst for long-term change. As peasants and workers gained more bargaining power, the feudal lords were forced to offer better terms to retain their labour force. This shift in the balance of power gradually eroded the feudal system, making way for a more market-driven economy. Instead of being bound to a lord's land, workers began to seek out paid labour in emerging industries, leading to the rise of a more mobile and flexible workforce. At the same time, merchants, traders, and banking families began to rise in influence. With the collapse of the old social order, new opportunities arose for those with capital to invest. The growth of trade, particularly with the East, began to fuel the development of new markets and industries. The traditional system of land-based wealth was replaced, in part, by wealth derived from commerce. The rise of the merchant class, which had long been seen as secondary to the landed nobility, now became central to the new economic order. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, banking families such as the Medici began to accumulate vast amounts of wealth, using their capital not just to fund trade, but to invest in art, education, and the emerging ideas of the Renaissance. This transition from a land-based economy to a money-driven economy was crucial in laying the foundation for the capitalist system that would dominate the coming centuries. As the feudal system crumbled, new economic structures began to take shape. The labour market shifted toward a more entrepreneurial model, where individuals could work for wages, own property, and pursue profit outside the rigid constraints of feudal obligations. This new economic freedom marked the beginning of a system where the potential for upward mobility was greater, and where wealth could be acquired through trade, industry, and investment, rather than through inheritance or land. But this transition was not without its challenges. As the old power structures disintegrated, so too did the social hierarchies that had defined medieval life. The rise of capitalism was not just an economic shift, it was a social revolution. The old elites, who had once ruled with divine right and feudal loyalty, were forced to adapt to a new world where wealth and power were no longer confined to the nobility. The rise of the bourgeoisie, the merchant and artisan class, challenged the traditional aristocracy and began to reshape the very nature of European society. The Black Death, then, was not just a tragic moment in history, it was the spark that ignited the slow burn of a new economic era. Feudalism, a system that had dominated for centuries, began to give way to a more fluid and dynamic economy, one that valued trade, capital, and mobility over birthright and land ownership. The survivors of the plague had unwittingly set the stage for the rise of capitalism, the economic system that would shape the world for the next 500 years. The Black Death, with its decimation of entire populations, had one unexpected byproduct: the rapid growth of cities. The plague emptied the streets of many towns and villages, but out of the wreckage, something new began to take shape. Where once rural life had been dominant, now the cities, those centres of commerce and opportunity, began to expand, pulling in survivors and migrants from the countryside in search of work, security, and a chance to rebuild their lives. As rural areas were depopulated, urban areas began to grow. Cities became magnets for those who had lost everything. The rise of commerce, coupled with the increased mobility of labour, drew people to urban centers where jobs in trade, industry, and services were more plentiful. For the first time, people from all walks of life, peasants, artisans, traders, and even former serfs, found themselves living side by side in burgeoning metropolises. The social structure that had dominated rural life was loosened, and in its place arose new dynamics, where merit, skill, and economic success began to dictate one's position in society. The cities themselves underwent dramatic transformations. As the old feudal land-based economy gave way to a market-driven one, urban centers began to flourish as hubs of trade and industry. Venice, Genoa, and Florence became powerful trading ports connecting Europe with the East and Africa. Markets, banks, and workshops sprung up in the wake of the plague's devastation, creating the foundation for the economic boom that would follow in the Renaissance. The labor shortage, combined with the rise of new wealth from trade, meant that the cities were flooded with opportunities. Artisans and merchants, once seen as lower class or secondary to the landed nobility, now began to wield significant power. This urbanization was not just an economic shift, but a cultural one as well. With cities becoming the focal points of trade and industry, they also became centers of innovation and creativity. The growth of the bourgeoisie, the emerging middle class, began to influence not just the economy, but the arts, politics, and education. The wealth generated by trade allowed for patronage of artists and thinkers, spurring the intellectual and cultural revolutions that would later become synonymous with the Renaissance. But the rise of the European city was not just about economic growth, it was also about the creation of new social and political structures. As cities grew in size and importance, the old feudal hierarchy gave way to more fluid forms of governance. Guilds, merchant associations, and city councils began to take on roles that had once been filled by monarchs and nobles. These urban centers became political powerhouses, where local rulers were often more concerned with maintaining trade routes, regulating commerce, and managing the wealth generated by industry than with enforcing the dictates of the feudal system. As the medieval order began to dissolve, the cities became the breeding grounds for new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new systems of governance. They were not just places of economic activity, but laboratories for the social and political experimentation that would lay the foundation for the modern world. In many ways, the cities of post-plague Europe were the crucibles in which the ideas of capitalism, democracy, and the modern state would be forged. These urban centers, which had once been seen as simple hubs of trade, were now becoming the heart of a new world order, one in which the pursuit of wealth, the freedom of the individual, and the development of new technologies would dominate. They were becoming the engines of the economic and cultural transformations that would propel Europe into a new age. As Europe's cities grew in size, wealth, and influence, the social fabric of Europe began to change. The rise of the middle class, the expansion of commerce, and the rise of banking families would all combine to create a new economic system, capitalism. And it was from these urban centers that the influence of European powers would spread across the world, as the forces of trade and exploration began to intertwine with the burgeoning capitalist economy. The rise of the European city, then, was not just a product of the Black Death's devastation, but also a pivotal moment in the history of Europe, a moment when the foundation of the modern world was laid, and the shape of the future began to emerge. As the survivors rebuilt their cities, they didn't just rebuild their physical structures, they began to redefine the world itself, laying the groundwork for an economic, social, and political revolution that would echo through the centuries to come. In the aftermath of the Black Death, Europe was left in the throes of devastation, but it was within this darkness that a new light began to flicker. The Black Death, which had claimed millions of lives, was a tragedy so immense that it left scars not only on the body but also on the mind. Yet, paradoxically, this great loss would serve as the fertile ground from which Europe's greatest cultural awakening would sprout the Renaissance. The intellectual revival that followed would lay the foundations for the modern world, setting Europe on a path toward a new way of thinking, questioning, and creating. The immediate aftermath of the plague was a world of uncertainty, confusion, and grief. As millions perished, survivors were left to grapple with a universe that seemed unpredictable and beyond their control. This profound trauma led to an intellectual shift, a desire to understand, to make sense of the chaos, and to find meaning in an age of profound loss. Philosophers, writers, and scholars began to turn away from the traditional medieval view of the world, which had been dominated by religious and superstitious explanations, and instead sought to rediscover the knowledge of the ancients. The rediscovery of classical antiquity was one of the defining elements of the intellectual revival that followed the plague. For centuries, much of the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome had been obscured or neglected by the medieval period. But as the survivors of the Black Death began to rebuild, they looked back to the great thinkers and artists of the classical world, inspired by their ideas, their achievements, and their approaches to life. It was through this rediscovery of classical texts and ideas that the foundations for the Renaissance were laid. Humanism, the intellectual movement that emphasized the value and agency of human beings, became the driving force behind this revival. Humanists began to challenge the medieval worldview, which saw human existence as secondary to divine will, and instead promoted the idea that individuals could shape their own destinies. This was a radical shift, a new understanding of humanity's potential and the world's possibilities. As humanism gained traction, thinkers like Petrarch, Erasmus, and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola began to explore new ideas in philosophy, literature, and ethics, questioning the nature of human existence, knowledge, and freedom. The intellectual revival wasn't limited to philosophy and the humanities. The study of science began to emerge from the shadow of religious doctrine. Natural philosophy, which had long been dominated by theology, began to evolve into a more empirical study of the world. Scholars began to ask questions about the laws of nature, the workings of the universe, and the human body, questions that would eventually lead to groundbreaking discoveries in anatomy, astronomy, and physics. While the scientific revolution was still centuries away, the seeds of inquiry were planted in this period, as intellectuals started to challenge the notion that all knowledge was predetermined by God's will. The Black Death had shattered the old order, but in doing so, it made room for new ideas to take root. In the wake of such immense suffering, Europe was primed for an intellectual reawakening, one that would not just rebuild, but transform society. The plague had shown humanity's vulnerability, but it also revealed the power of the human spirit to rebuild and renew. The intellectual revival of the Renaissance, ignited by the survivors of the plague, was an act of defiance against the darkness, a declaration that, despite the fragility of life, there was much to be learned, much to be created, and much to be understood. As the intellectual revival progressed, new centers of learning and knowledge began to emerge. The universities of Europe, particularly in Italy, began to attract scholars and students from across the continent. The Renaissance had its intellectual epicenter in the city-states of Italy, especially Florence, where the Medici family would become patrons of both the arts and humanist thought. These thinkers and scholars, inspired by the rediscovery of the classical past, would go on to challenge medieval ideas and establish the intellectual framework for modern science, art, and philosophy. The intellectual revival of the Renaissance was not just a return to ancient ideas, but a transformation of them. It was a period of profound intellectual growth and renewal that laid the groundwork for the next phase of the Renaissance, the artistic revolution. As philosophers and scholars began to understand humanity and the world around them in new ways, artists, architects, and thinkers would begin to translate these ideas into a new language of visual expression. But this intellectual rebirth was not just about rediscovering the past, it was about reinventing the future. And in that process, Europe would forever change. The Black Death, though most devastating in Europe, was not confined to its borders. While Europe reeled from the catastrophic loss of life, the plague's reach stretched far beyond the continent, creating a global crisis that would leave its mark on Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. In fact, the interconnectedness of the medieval world, driven by trade, military campaigns, and diplomatic relations, allowed the plague to travel across continents, highlighting the vulnerabilities of global systems and the fragility of civilization itself. The first reports of the plague in Europe trace back to the Mongol Empire's expansive reach across Asia. It is believed that the disease first appeared in the port cities of China, where it quickly spread along trade routes, carried by merchants and soldiers alike. The Silk Road, a vital trade network connecting the East with Europe, became the plague's main conduit, facilitating its spread across Central Asia, the Middle East, and ultimately into Europe. But long before the plague reached the shores of the Mediterranean, it had already ravaged much of the rest of the world. In China, the impact was devastating. Some estimates suggest that a third of the population perished. The Yuan dynasty, which ruled over China at the time, saw its power severely weakened as entire communities were decimated by the disease. The plague caused mass migration, as people fled the infected regions, and trade, the lifeblood of the empire, came to a halt. The Mongols, who had once been a symbol of unstoppable force and conquest, found their empire fracturing under the weight of the plague. In the Middle East, the disease spread rapidly along the trade routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and the Levant. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo were hit hard, with staggering mortality rates. The Black Death decimated populations, destabilized local economies, and strained the political systems that had once flourished in the region. The Ottoman Empire, which was emerging as a new power, was also affected, although its impact would be felt more in the coming decades, as the empire's forces were weakened by internal instability. Africa, too, was not spared from the plague. Though the disease spread more slowly across the continent, parts of North Africa, especially Egypt, were hit hard. The coastal cities of North Africa, where trade with Europe and the Middle East was most active, suffered the most. The disruption of trade, agriculture, and society left deep scars that would take years to recover from. In sub-Saharan Africa, the impact of the plague was less severe, but the continent was still affected by the shifts in global trade and the movements of people that followed in the plague's wake. What became increasingly clear as the plague spread across these vast regions was the extent to which the medieval world was interconnected. The Silk Road, the Mediterranean trade routes, and the maritime routes along Africa's coast created a web of exchange that, though it facilitated the spread of goods and ideas, also exposed societies to new, deadly risks. The Black Death illuminated the vulnerabilities inherent in this global system. Once thriving trade cities became ghost towns, their marketplaces silenced, their economies destroyed. Kingdoms and empires that had once been powerful found themselves weakened, their military and administrative capabilities strained by the loss of manpower. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the plague's global spread was the shift in the way people saw the world. For centuries, the interconnectedness of regions had been driven by trade and conquest. But the arrival of a force as devastating as the plague made it painfully clear that what happened in one part of the world could have profound effects on the rest. The plague disrupted old power structures, highlighting the precarious nature of human civilization. The spread of the disease forced societies to reckon with their own vulnerabilities and their place within a global system that could not be controlled. While Europe, Asia, and the Middle East were the primary regions impacted by the plague, the disease's reach sent ripples through the global order, setting in motion a series of changes that would shape the course of history for centuries. The plague had not only reshaped societies, it had shown the world just how interconnected and fragile the systems that governed them truly were. In the aftermath of the Black Death, the world that emerged was a profoundly different one, marked by an increasing interconnectedness that would set the stage for the future of global trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. While the immediate effects of the plague were devastating, disrupting economies, causing social upheaval, and creating a sense of collective trauma, what followed was the beginning of a new era. The collapse of feudalism, the rise of merchant capitalism, and the expansion of trade routes created a more interconnected world, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the age of exploration. The labor shortage caused by the plague created a power shift in society. With so many workers dead, the remaining peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of newfound power. The wage demands that followed were one part of a larger economic transformation that would slowly chip away at the old feudal system. The growth of the merchant class, combined with a reduction in the power of the landed nobility, led to the rise of a more market-driven economy. This shift paved the way for the expansion of trade across the globe, as merchants increasingly sought new routes and opportunities to exchange goods. As Europe began to emerge from the darkness of the plague, cities once devastated by the disease became centers of commerce, learning, and innovation. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence were key players in the resurgence of trade, connecting Europe with Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The Black Death had disrupted existing trade networks, but the survivors, particularly the growing middle class of merchants, traders, and bankers, began to forge new connections, creating new economic opportunities. These cities became the hubs for the exchange of goods, wealth, and ideas. At the same time, The growing influence of the merchant class contributed to the rise of capitalism. Wealth was no longer tied exclusively to land ownership, as it had been during feudalism. Instead, it began to be derived from trade, banking, and investment. Banking families such as the Medici in Florence gained immense influence, providing capital for trade and the arts. This shift in economic power laid the foundations for the modern global economy. Perhaps one of the most significant developments in this period was the expansion of maritime exploration. The desire for new trade routes, spurred in part by the disruption of overland trade during the plague, led to a series of voyages that would change the course of history. With the rise of new technologies, such as the compass, the astrolabe, and improved shipbuilding techniques, explorers began to chart new territories, particularly along the coasts of Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas. The voyages of figures like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan were not just the result of a desire for wealth. They were driven by a vision of a more connected world, one in which distant continents and cultures could be linked together through trade and exploration. These voyages would eventually lead to the European colonization of the Americas and the opening of global trade routes that would span the globe. But the early seeds of these endeavors were sown in the wake of the Black Death. The interconnectedness of the world, once limited by geographical and political barriers, was now becoming a reality. As European powers established trading posts and colonies across the world, goods, ideas, and technologies flowed across continents, creating an increasingly interconnected global network. In addition to the economic and political transformations, the global exchange of culture and ideas also accelerated during this period. The Renaissance, which had been sparked by the intellectual revival in Italy, spread to other parts of Europe, bringing with it new philosophies, artistic techniques, and scientific knowledge. The printing press, which would play a crucial role in disseminating these ideas, was invented in the mid-15th century, further accelerating the spread of knowledge. The increased exchange of goods and ideas between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia led to the fusion of cultures, with influences from the Islamic world, India, China, and Africa enriching European art, science, and philosophy. The Black Death, despite its horrors, had catalyzed a transformation in the way the world was connected. The collapse of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, and the expansion of trade created a more globalized world, one where exploration and cultural exchange would pave the way for the modern age. The interconnectedness of nations, trade routes, and cultures would continue to grow, culminating in the age of exploration and the eventual establishment of global empires. In this new world, no region existed in isolation. The global exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies would shape the future of humanity. And in many ways, it was the devastating impact of the Black Death that pushed humanity into this new era of global interconnectedness, an era that would lead to discoveries, conflicts, and exchanges that would redefine the course of history. This chapter highlights how the global spread of the plague not only reshaped Europe, but also had lasting effects on global trade, exploration, and interconnectedness. It set the stage for a new era in which cultures and economies would become more integrated, eventually leading to the globalization we recognize today. In the aftermath of the Black Death, the world that emerged was a profoundly different one, marked by an increasing interconnectedness that would set the stage for the future of global trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. While the immediate effects of the plague were devastating, disrupting economies, causing social upheaval, and creating a sense of collective trauma, what followed was the beginning of a new era. The collapse of feudalism, the rise of merchant capitalism, and the expansion of trade routes created a more interconnected world, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the age of exploration. The labor shortage caused by the plague created a power shift in society. With so many workers dead, the remaining peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of newfound power. The wage demands that followed were one part of a larger economic transformation that would slowly chip away at the old feudal system. The growth of the merchant class, combined with a reduction in the power of the landed nobility, led to the rise of a more market-driven economy. This shift paved the way for the expansion of trade across the globe, as merchants increasingly sought new routes and opportunities to exchange goods. As Europe began to emerge from the darkness of the plague, cities once devastated by the disease became centers of commerce, learning, and innovation. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence were key players in the resurgence of trade, connecting Europe with Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The Black Death had disrupted existing trade networks, but the survivors, particularly the growing middle class of merchants, traders, and bankers, began to forge new connections, creating new economic opportunities. These cities became the hubs for the exchange of goods, wealth, and ideas. At the same time, the growing influence of the merchant class contributed to the rise of capitalism. Wealth was no longer tied exclusively to land ownership, as it had been during feudalism. Instead, it began to be derived from trade, banking, and investment. Banking families such as the Medici in Florence gained immense influence, providing capital for trade and the arts. This shift in economic power laid the foundations for the modern global economy. Perhaps one of the most significant developments in this period was the expansion of maritime exploration. The desire for new trade routes, spurred in part by the disruption of overland trade during the plague, led to a series of voyages that would change the course of history. With the rise of new technologies, such as the compass, the astrolabe, and improved shipbuilding techniques, explorers began to chart new territories, particularly along the coasts of Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas. The voyages of figures like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan were not just the result of a desire for wealth. They were driven by a vision of a more connected world, one in which distant continents and cultures could be linked together through trade and exploration. These voyages would eventually lead to the European colonization of the Americas and the opening of global trade routes that would span the globe. But the early seeds of these endeavors were sown in the wake of the Black Death. The interconnectedness of the world, once limited by geographical and political barriers, was now becoming a reality. As European powers established trading posts and colonies across the world, goods, ideas, and technologies flowed across continents, creating an increasingly interconnected global network. In addition to the economic and political transformations, the global exchange of culture and ideas also accelerated during this period. The Renaissance, which had been sparked by the intellectual revival in Italy, spread to other parts of Europe, bringing with it new philosophies, artistic techniques, and scientific knowledge. The printing press, which would play a crucial role in disseminating these ideas, was invented in the mid-15th century, further accelerating the spread of knowledge. The increased exchange of goods and ideas between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia led to the fusion of cultures, with influences from the Islamic world, India, China, and Africa enriching European art, science, and philosophy. The Black Death, despite its horrors, had catalyzed a transformation in the way the world was connected. The collapse of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, and the expansion of trade created a more globalized world, one where exploration and cultural exchange would pave the way for the modern age. The interconnectedness of nations, trade routes, and cultures would continue to grow, culminating in the age of exploration and the eventual establishment of global empires. In this new world, no region existed in isolation. The global exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies would shape the future of humanity. And in many ways, it was the devastating impact of the Black Death that pushed humanity into this new era of global interconnectedness, an era that would lead to discoveries, conflicts, and exchanges that would redefine the course of history. This chapter highlights how the global spread of the plague not only reshaped Europe, but also had lasting effects on global trade, exploration, and interconnectedness. It set the stage for a new era in which cultures and economies would become more integrated, eventually leading to the globalization we recognize today. The Black Death left Europe broken, shattered by the sheer scale of death and suffering it brought. It erased entire generations, leaving fields fallow, cities empty, and a population struggling to make sense of a world turned upside down. Yet, in the wake of this unimaginable catastrophe, something remarkable began to emerge. The plague, despite its devastation, served as the catalyst for profound transformation, changing the very fabric of European society. In the immediate aftermath, Europe was a continent in mourning, grappling with grief and a palpable sense of loss. But as the survivors began to rebuild, they found themselves in a new world, one where the old systems no longer worked, and where new ideas began to take root. The death of so many people forced the survivors to confront the fundamental structure of their society, and in doing so, they began to change it. One of the most significant transformations was the slow but inevitable decline of feudalism. Feudalism had defined medieval Europe for centuries, creating a rigid hierarchy where kings and lords controlled land, and peasants served as the labor force that sustained the system. But the plague, by killing so many of the laboring class, exposed the cracks in this system. With so many peasants gone, those who survived suddenly found themselves in a position of power. Labor became scarce, and workers could now demand better wages and conditions. This shift in the balance of power began to erode the old feudal order. The traditional land-based economy was no longer sustainable, and a new market-driven economy began to take shape. At the same time, the emergence of capitalism began to take root. The power of the land-owning aristocracy began to wane, while a new class of merchants, traders, and bankers grew in wealth and influence. This shift was slow but inevitable, as the focus of wealth moved away from land and towards commerce and trade. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Genoa became powerful hubs of trade and finance, where merchants and banking families began to play a leading role in shaping the economic landscape. This was the beginning of a new economic order, one where wealth could be built through trade, industry, and investment, rather than inheritance or land ownership. But the Black Death's legacy wasn't just economic, it was intellectual and cultural as well. As Europe recovered, a new wave of thinking began to take shape. The Renaissance, which followed in the wake of the plague, was a cultural rebirth that would come to define Europe for the next several centuries. The intellectual revival of humanism, which emphasized the potential of individual human beings, flourished during this period. Scholars, artists, and thinkers rediscovered classical antiquity, and the study of philosophy, science, and art began to flourish. What had once been a world dominated by the Church's teachings was now one where reason, creativity, and innovation could thrive. The plague, though it had killed millions, had inadvertently sparked a cultural revolution. The survivors, who had witnessed the fragility of life, turned toward new ways of thinking, creating, and living. The horrors of the Black Death made them question the old ways of life and inspired them to seek out new ideas and new systems. This intellectual and cultural shift would later give birth to the great works of the Renaissance, from the art of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo to the political philosophy of Machiavelli and the scientific observations of Copernicus. What followed the Black Death was not just a return to normal, but the birth of something entirely new. A new social order began to emerge, one that valued individual achievement, creativity, and intellectual inquiry over birthright and tradition. This would set the stage for the transformation of Europe into a modern world, one defined by commerce, creativity, and scientific exploration. The plague, though tragic, had sparked this transformation, and Europe would never be the same. The rise of capitalism, the decline of feudalism, the flourishing of art and science, these were all seeds sown in the wake of the Black Death. And while the plague itself had caused immeasurable suffering, it was this very suffering that led to the creation of a new world. Europe had been forever altered, not just by the loss of life, but by the way the survivors rebuilt their society in response to the devastation. They turned tragedy into transformation, and from the ashes of the old world, a new Europe emerged. The survivors of the Black Death were, in many ways, the architects of the modern world. They lived through a trauma that most could never have imagined, a catastrophe that reshaped not only the physical landscape of Europe, but also the very way people thought about life, death, and their place in the world. What, then, was the legacy of these survivors, who had witnessed the worst of humanity's frailty? And how did their resilience shape the future of Europe and the world? In the immediate aftermath of the plague, survival became the focus. Life had been reduced to its most basic form: food, shelter, and safety. But as the survivors began to rebuild, they started to think beyond mere survival. They began to ask fundamental questions about the world they inhabited, about power, governance, faith, and human potential. These questions, driven by the collective experience of the plague, would push Europe into a new age, one of intellectual, social, and economic change. The resilience of the survivors was not just a matter of physical endurance, but of intellectual and emotional adaptation. In the face of loss, people began to reimagine their relationship with the world. The destruction of the Black Death had shown just how fragile human life was, but it also gave people the opportunity to think differently about how they lived, how they governed, and how they created. They had faced death in its most absolute form, and in doing so, they learned to value life in ways that would come to define the Renaissance. The survivors of the plague were also the ones who saw the collapse of the old social order and the rise of new possibilities. With the decline of feudalism, they were free to explore new economic, political, and social systems. The labor shortage gave them bargaining power, and the rise of merchant capitalism allowed them to build wealth outside of the traditional feudal structure. Cities became centers of commerce and culture, drawing people from the countryside and creating new opportunities for social mobility. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the survivors was their role in the intellectual and cultural revival that followed. They were the ones who sought out new ideas, rediscovered the classical past, and began to shape a new vision for humanity. They laid the foundation for the Renaissance, which would see the flourishing of art, science, literature, and philosophy. In a world where death had reigned, the survivors embraced the idea of life, of living fully, of creating, and of discovering. They recognized that the human experience was fragile, but also capable of greatness. The legacy of the survivors was not just in the world they rebuilt, but in the way they changed the very course of history. They proved that, even in the face of unimaginable loss, the human spirit could endure, adapt, and thrive. The Renaissance, which began in the wake of the Black Death, was not just a rebirth of art and culture, it was a rebirth of humanity itself. The survivors had transformed tragedy into opportunity, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the modern world. The impact of the plague's survivors extended far beyond their own lifetimes. Their resilience shaped the future of Europe, from the rise of capitalism to the expansion of global trade, from the growth of cities to the flowering of ideas. The survivors had not just rebuilt, they had reinvented the world, and the legacy of that reinvention continues to echo through history. Today, the world is still shaped by the events that followed the Black Death. The changes initiated by the survivors continue to influence our political, economic, and cultural systems. The survivors of the plague may have been born out of tragedy, but their legacy is one of triumph, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of reinvention and renewal. As we reflect on the impact of the Black Death, we must recognize that it was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point in history, one that changed the course of Europe and the world. The survivors, through their strength and creativity, left a legacy that still defines our modern world today.